One thing I think definitely worth touching upon is that sort of mindset that people tend to complain about getting stuck in the box. And it's very easy to do, to be honest. I guess you get taught these scales and you get taught these shapes, and people often struggle with the idea of maybe combining them, or just get very fixated on the fact that if you want to maybe play a minor pentatonic, that's how it goes. And it's a little bit sort of just hard to step outside of that. And I remember something I was introduced to relatively early on in my playing was the notion that, well, all of those notes that you've just played are available on one string. And if you make sure you know where they are relative to one another, it just opens up the neck in terms of moving maybe that way as opposed to entirely down towards the floor. So that minor pentatonic, as much as those notes, are very kind of neatly placed to move down, you can also play them going upwards, which seems like a very daft thing to say, but it's something that doesn't seem to sort of click for a lot of people, I guess, until a relatively late stage. But I think one thing definitely worth doing, and again, it was something that was sort of introduced to me relatively early on, was taking a simple riff and just trying to replicate that in as many places over the neck as you can. And I think what that does is, as much as it will, by osmosis, you will start to familiarise yourself with the different pentatonic shapes, it'll just familiarise yourself with the intervals between the notes and the spaces between them and where the notes are relative to one another. So say we take something, just a simple kind of riff like that. It's a little bit repetitive and a little bit boring, but I think it just slowly sort of opens up the idea that the notes are interconnected with one another, and it's not just a series of boxes that are tacked onto the neck here, and it just opens up your thinking to be a little bit more free and viewing it as an instrument and not necessarily just a guitar, which I think guitarists are a little bit guilty of getting stuck in that mindset of shapes and boxes, and they undoubtedly have their uses, but it's opening up the guitar to be a little bit more of a musical instrument, I guess, full stop. So I think another thing definitely worth looking at, speaking of getting stuck in boxes, is looking at the major scale. And it's one of those things that if you guys watching or anything like me, I remember being shown that when I was a kid, and it just being a little bit of a case of, oh, that's 10 times harder to play than the minor pentatonic shape. Suddenly the notes are having to stretch that much further to reach them as opposed to... And just kind of filing it away in the back of my head under the sort of, I'll learn that later sort of category. And just not getting around to it for a very long time. And I think for me, at least, personally speaking, the major scale is the most musical fluid sounding thing that I use 99% of the time, and if it suits, it's just where my vocabulary lies on the fretboard, I guess. So just, it sounds like an obvious thing to say given, at least 50% of music, I guess, is going to be in a major key, but really explore that idea of playing in a major scale. And the one which I remember a light bulb moment, a very vivid light bulb moment for me, was watching Slash on a Guns N' Roses DVD when I was a kid, moving effortlessly between major pentatonic and minor pentatonic. And at that point, I didn't really know what the major pentatonic was. A major scale for me was, as I said, that sort of slightly awkward, stretchy thing. And just remember watching him and thinking, he seems to be playing exactly the same shapes and the same sort of, the intervals between the notes look exactly the same as when he's playing that darker sounding stuff a minute ago. And it sort of clicked then for me that, well, if you start that note, start that scale even going downwards, it's the same shape as the minor pentatonic. And there, for me, started this sort of couple of years of being very much stuck in that major pentatonic box, and not necessarily sort of appreciating that, well, you're very close to actually playing the do, re, mi major scale, albeit shy of one or two notes. And again, getting that into my vocabulary was just a little bit of a light bulb moment in making things just infinitely more musical. And you're very close to it, ironically. And then, 90% of the stuff I do is very much based around that. as I said, it's the area I find easiest to sort of express myself musically in, is the major scale. And if anything, I kind of struggle a little bit going back to minor stuff every now and then, but just explore the major scale, I guess, is the sort of take-home message of that, and it's not necessarily sort of the evil that I imagined it as when I was a kid. So throw yourself into it. Yeah, I guess blues is a great place to start in terms of maybe looking to mix the major pentatonic and the minor pentatonic together. A cool way of doing that, again, using that idea of maybe taking a riff and replicating that in different places, is doing exactly that, but mixing between your major and your minor. So say you take, something ostensibly minor in A minor, replicating that then in A major. Taking something that is very similar at a quick glance, but obviously sounds wildly different, and then just learning to sort of incorporate those two things together. And again, repetition is such a kind of massive part of soloing. It's building melodies, it's building structures, it's building something that the audience can kind of latch onto as identifiable. And if they think they've heard that before, but they've heard it in a slightly different context, it just familiarizes them with what they're about to hear, I guess. So yeah, just kind of blending between those two things. Obviously, the more seamlessly you can do it, the better it's going to sound, but there's no better place to start than just really familiarizing yourself with the major scale. So, in terms of my approach to chords, I tend to use a lot of inversions. Although, to be honest, I'd be lying if I said I was familiar with them as inversions. When I started doing it, it was just different ways of playing chords, and that was how I kind of familiarized myself with it. But inversions essentially being, a way of just arranging the notes slightly differently. So instead of maybe going, your kind of bass is the first note that you're coming across, as you would with maybe a G major. Differ in that, so you play the major third first. The cool thing about that is it just gives you infinitely more scope to sort of do that pretty melodic Hendrixy stuff. And again, it all kind of traces its lineage back to Hendrix, at least for me, in terms of suddenly becoming aware that chords didn't necessarily have to be confined to the chord box. You listen, there's some great examples of his live work, especially. It's a great cover of like a Rolling Stone from the Monterey Pop Festival, where his rhythm work going on underneath. He's singing at the same time. How he's doing that, I don't know. And his rhythm work is just sublime. It's melodic, it's rhythmic, it's sort of nuanced and textured. It's just everything that you associate with Hendrix rhythm parts. And it's all that kind of all that sort of stuff going on underneath it. And that was just a bit of an eye-opener in terms of, rhythm stuff can be cool, rhythm stuff can be melodic and can be its own kind of cool little thing unto itself. So as I said, that's a lot of chord inversions in terms of just switching the order of the notes. So the obvious one that I use a hell of a lot for major chords, as I said, is that sort of flipping it around so you've got the major third first. So for a G chord, taking your, and then adding in that major third. Again, just shifting that shape. Just giving you a little bit more scope for kind of moving stuff around and pretty stuff ultimately. A big part of that again is getting that kind of thumb over Hendrix with his big hands, and just shifting the way you play the most basic of chords. So maybe a major chord becomes minor chords tend to lend themselves to that style of playing particularly well, because it's less fingers involved ultimately, again, for the shape of the chords, so you can sort of move stuff around very nicely. But just, delving into rhythm stuff a little bit more in terms of melodic stuff and not just being confined to chords, I guess, ultimately.